I want to start by telling you the exact moment I realized my life had been stolen from me, not recently, but 3 years before I even noticed it was gone. I was sitting across from a detective in a gray interview room, not a conference room, a police interview room, with a camera mounted in the corner and a metal table between us. He slid a manila folder across to me and said, very calmly, "Mr. Calloway, can you tell me about these loan applications?" I opened the folder. My name was on every single page. My home address, my professional credentials, my CPA license number, my social security number. 8 business loan applications filed across 37 months, totaling just over $812,000. I had never seen any of them before in my life. That's where this story ends. But to understand how I got to that room, I need to take you back to where it started, to a Tuesday morning, a spreadsheet, and a number that simply didn't belong. I had been a senior accountant at Meridian Consolidated for 6 years. It wasn't a glamorous company. Mid-sized logistics firm, offices in 4 states, about 300 employees across all locations. I worked in the finance department at the corporate headquarters in Ohio, and my job was exactly what you'd expect: reconciling accounts, preparing financial reports, auditing departmental budgets. I was good at it. More than good, honestly. I had a reputation for catching things other people missed. My manager was a man named Douglas Fitch. Doug had been with the company for 11 years, and he carried himself with the specific kind of authority that comes from outlasting multiple rounds of leadership changes. He was careful, deliberate, and almost pathologically controlled. I had worked directly under him for 4 of my 6 years there, and in all that time, I could count on one hand the number of times he raised his voice or lost composure. My wife, Claire, called him the audit robot, and she wasn't wrong. Doug didn't do anything without a reason. I liked working for him. That's important to say. I had no personal problem with Doug Fitch. He had mentored me, given me strong performance reviews, and once gone to bat for me when another department tried to pull me into a project that would have consumed my entire quarter. I trusted him. And that's exactly why the number on that spreadsheet unsettled me so much. It was a Tuesday in February. I was performing a routine month-end reconciliation for the operations account, one of 3 accounts I oversaw, when I noticed a transfer I couldn't account for. $47,000 transferred to an external vendor account tagged only as SVC Consulting 04. No attached invoice, no project code, no corresponding approval signature in the ledger. Just a number, moving out of the company's money and landing somewhere I couldn't identify. I flagged it internally, assuming it was a processing error or a misfiled document. These things happened occasionally. I sent a note to the accounts payable team and moved on. 3 days later, I came back to check the resolution status. The flag had been cleared. The note attached simply said, "Resolved, approved at management level." No further documentation. No invoice that had magically appeared. The flag was gone, and the $47,000 was gone with it. I sat with that for a day. I went through the prior 6 months of the operations account looking for similar patterns. I found 11 more. Same type of vendor code. Same absence of documentation. Same pattern of cleared flags with the same vague approved at management level notation. The amounts varied, some as low as $9,000, one as high as $83,000. In 6 months, just under $420,000 had moved out of the operations account through this channel. $420,000. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't excitement. It was a slow, cold dread, because every one of those transfers had been processed through the approvals chain, which meant either there was a documentation failure at a massive scale, or someone with management authority had intentionally structured them this way. And the only person with the authority level to approve operational transfers in that range, without triggering the executive oversight threshold, was Douglas Fitch. I didn't want it to be him. I genuinely did not want that to be the answer. I spent 3 days trying to construct an alternative explanation, a vendor with an unusual invoicing system. A pilot program approved at the executive level that I simply hadn't been briefed on. A legitimate consulting arrangement that had slipped through the documentation process. None of it held up. When I cross-referenced the vendor codes against our master vendor registry, SVC Consulting 04 didn't exist. It wasn't a registered vendor. It wasn't a shell category for a legitimate account. It was a code someone had created, and it pointed nowhere I could trace from my access level. I made a decision. I was going to report this. Now, if you've never been a whistleblower, let me tell you something that nobody really prepares you for. The paperwork isn't the hard part. The hard part is the moment you pick up the phone or walk down the hallway, because you absolutely know that whatever happens next, your working life is about to change forever. There is no version of this where you report something like this, and then everything just goes back to normal. I knew that. I went anyway. I called the HR director's office and made an appointment for the following morning. Her name was Sandra Reeves. She had been with Meridian for 9 years, slightly longer than Doug, and she ran the HR department with an efficiency that most people admired. She was professional, measured, and good at making you feel like your concerns were taken seriously. I had interacted with her maybe 6 or 7 times over the years, never in a negative context. Annual review sign-offs. A benefits question once. One occasion when I'd needed documentation for a personal leave request. I liked Sandra. I thought she was one of the more competent people in the building. I walked into her office at 9 the next morning, with a printed summary of everything I'd found: the transfer records, the vendor code analysis, the pattern of cleared flags, the total dollar amount across 6 months. 12 pages. I had spent the previous evening organizing it carefully, because I wanted to be taken seriously. I wanted there to be no ambiguity. I wanted to make absolutely certain that when someone looked at this, they saw what I saw. Sandra read through it. She asked me several clarifying questions: whether I had spoken to Doug directly, whether I had discussed this with anyone else in the department, whether I had preserved the original data, or only worked from copies. I answered everything honestly. No, I hadn't spoken to Doug. No, I hadn't told any colleagues. Yes, I had preserved the original data and brought copies. She thanked me. She told me this was exactly the kind of responsible reporting the company's ethics policy was designed to encourage. She said she would be consulting with the company's outside legal counsel before taking any formal action, and that I should expect a follow-up within 48 hours. She told me to keep the matter confidential, avoid any changes to the files I had flagged, and come to her immediately if anything changed. She shook my hand. I walked back to my desk, feeling genuinely like I had done the right thing. That was a Wednesday. By Friday afternoon, I was suspended. I didn't even see it coming. There was no confrontation, no escalating conversation, no warning signal. At 4:15 on Friday, Sandra appeared at my desk with a man from corporate security I had never seen before, and she handed me a letter on company letterhead, informing me that I was being placed on administrative suspension, effective immediately, pending an internal investigation. I was asked to surrender my access badge, my company laptop, and my physical office key. The security officer would escort me to collect my personal belongings. I remember standing up and asking Sandra very quietly, because there were colleagues watching, "Is this about what I brought to you?" She said, "I'm not able to discuss the details of an active investigation, Marcus." And that was the moment I first felt this specific, stomach-dropping sensation that something had gone badly wrong in a way I didn't yet understand. I drove home. I told Claire what had happened. She said the right things, that it would be sorted out, that I'd been clearly acting in good faith, that no legitimate company could retaliate against a whistleblower this openly. She held my hand at the kitchen table. I tried to believe her. "I want to tell you right now. I should have called an attorney that same night. I didn't. I waited 4 more days, still expecting the company to call and explain. That was a mistake I will never fully forgive myself for. If you take nothing else from this story, take that. The moment something like this happens, you call a lawyer. You do not wait. You do not trust the process. You call a lawyer. If you're finding this story useful or you want to follow more stories like it, hitting subscribe costs you nothing, and it's how I know to keep making these. On the fifth day, I stopped waiting and called an employment attorney named Gerald Park. He took my initial call on a Tuesday morning, listened to my account for 40 minutes, and asked me 2 questions I wasn't prepared for. The first question: have you checked your personal credit report recently? I had not. The second question: do you have any business entities registered under your name that you didn't create yourself? I did not know the answer. I found out within the hour. I pulled my credit report while still on the phone with Gerald. There were 3 business credit accounts I had never opened, 2 lines of credit through commercial lenders I didn't recognize, and 5 hard inquiries from financial institutions within the past 37 months that I could not account for. My credit score, which had been above 790 the last time I'd checked, had dropped to 641. I felt physically ill. Gerald told me to stay on the line. He walked me through how to check the state business registry database for my name. We found 2 LLCs registered in Ohio, with my name listed as the sole managing member. I had never filed paperwork for either of them. I had never signed anything. I had never appeared before a notary. Someone had done all of it. Using my name, using my credentials, possibly using a forged signature on every document. And then Gerald said something that finally connected the dots in a way that made the room tilt around me. He said, "Marcus, I need you to think very carefully. Is there any chance your CPA license number, your social security number, or copies of your professional credentials were ever stored in a system at your workplace that someone else could have accessed?" Of course they were. They were in my HR personnel file, the file that Sandra Reeves' department maintained. The file that Sandra Reeves had complete and unrestricted access to. I want to describe what that realization feels like, because I don't think most people can imagine it until it happens to them. It's not like a dramatic movie moment where everything suddenly makes sense and you feel a surge of righteous anger. It's quieter than that. It's a kind of slow collapse, like a building losing structural supports one by one, not all at once. Each connection I made pulled out another beam, and I just stood there feeling the whole architecture of what I thought was happening give way around me. Sandra hadn't flagged my report for investigation. Sandra had flagged me. She had taken my 12 carefully organized pages of evidence, the evidence I had handed her with both hands, across her desk, while she nodded and thanked me, and she had used them to understand exactly how much I knew, exactly what I had traced, and exactly how much time she had before an outside investigator connected the same dots I had. And then she had suspended me, removed my access, and positioned me, the person who had discovered the fraud, as the person responsible for it. I need to pause here for a second, because this is the part of the story that I find most difficult to talk about even now. Not because of what it meant for me legally, though that was terrifying enough, but because I had walked into her office and trusted her. I had prepared that report to be as clear and comprehensive as possible because I wanted to make her job easy. I had handed Sandra Reeves a map of everything she needed to know in order to protect herself, and she had smiled, shaken my hand, and used every page of it against me. Would you have seen it coming? I genuinely wonder sometimes. Were there signs I should have caught? Gerald moved fast once I told him about the LLCs and the credit accounts. He filed an immediate fraud report with the Ohio Attorney General's office, the FTC, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. He also drafted a letter to Meridian's outside legal counsel, putting them on formal notice of the identity theft and asserting my whistleblower protections under Ohio law. That letter went out on a Thursday. The following Tuesday, I got a call from a federal agent named Kowalski. He was polite but direct. He explained that my name had recently come up in the context of a broader financial investigation that had been initiated not by my report to Sandra, which had apparently gone nowhere internally, but by an external tip to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division that had arrived approximately 3 weeks before I had walked into Sandra's office. Someone else had been watching Meridian. What Kowalski couldn't tell me at that point, But what I later pieced together through Gerald, and through the eventual court proceedings, was this. The investigation that was already underway had identified two primary financial actors within the company. One was Douglas Fitch, whose unauthorized vendor transfers I had documented. But the scope of what Doug had done was actually much smaller than what was happening at a different level of the organization. The larger scheme, the LLCs, the business loans, the forged credentials, the external financial accounts that was Sandra Reeves. Doug had been running a relatively straightforward embezzlement through the vendor payment system, but Sandra had been running something considerably more sophisticated. She had identified employees in the finance department, employees whose personnel files she controlled, but employees with professional credentials that carried financial credibility, and she had been using their identities to establish business entities and secure commercial loans. The money from those loans moved through the LLCs and was then distributed through a layered series of transfers designed to look like ordinary business expenses. I wasn't the only one. There were 4 of us in total. But I was the one with the most complete professional profile, the CPA license, the years of documented financial expertise which made my credentials the most valuable to her scheme. She had filed more loan applications under my name than under any of the others. 8 applications. Over 3 years. $812,000. When I filed my whistleblower complaint about Doug's vendor transfers, Sandra had not panicked. She had calculated. She had recognized that if Doug's transfers were investigated, it was only a matter of time before a broader audit expanded into the financial activity she had been generating using employee credentials, because some of those LLC accounts had been used to receive transfers that moved through the craters. A same general ledger system I had been auditing. She needed to create distance between herself and the scheme, and she needed to create a plausible alternative explanation for the financial anomalies. So she did something genuinely audacious. She used my suspension, framed as a response to suspected financial misconduct, to position me as a potential insider actor. If investigators came looking for the source of the fraudulent loan applications, the paper trail would lead to my name, my credentials, my professional history, and there I would be, conveniently already suspended for financial irregularities, already under an internal investigation cloud that she had personally constructed. She had been planning her exit. My report simply accelerated the timeline. This is the part where I tell you about the interview room. 3 weeks after Gerald's letters went out, the federal investigation formally intersected with my case. Agent Kowalski called me in for a sit-down. Not as a suspect, he said, as a person of interest with potentially relevant information. Gerald came with me. We sat in that gray room with the camera in the corner. Kowalski slid the folder across. My name on every page. The loan applications, the LLC filings, the forged signatures. He asked, "Mr. Calloway, can you tell me about these?" I told him everything. Every detail I've told you here. The Tuesday spreadsheet, the vendor code, the appointment with Sandra, the suspension, the credit report, the LLCs. Gerald sat beside me and let me talk. We had rehearsed this, and Gerald had been clear, full cooperation, complete transparency, nothing withheld. When I finished, Kowalski sat back and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your attorney's letters were actually quite helpful to us. We had already identified Reeves as a person of interest, but you accelerating the timeline, her suspending you, triggering your attorney's filings, it forced a set of actions on her part that we were able to document in real time. In other words, and I want to be very precise about this, because it matters, Sandra's attempt to frame me had partially backfired. Her move to suspend me and set me up as the fall guy had caused her to act quickly, and that speed had left traces. Financial movements she made in the 4 days between my report and my suspension. Communications she sent to external accounts that the investigation had already been monitoring. Document alterations in the HR system time-stamped within hours of my Wednesday morning appointment with her. She had been careful for 3 years. In the 4 days after I walked into her office, she made mistakes. I think about that a lot. I think about how close it came to going the other way. The arrests came 6 weeks later. Sandra Reeves was taken into custody on a Thursday morning. Douglas Fitch was arrested separately the same afternoon. He had been cooperating with investigators for 2 weeks by that point, exchanging testimony about his own embezzlement for consideration in his sentencing. The two of them, it turned out, had not been working together in any coordinated way. They had simply been running separate schemes within the same company, and Sandra had become aware of Doug's activity at some point and used it as a buffer if anyone looked too hard at the company's finances. Doug's transfers were there to absorb the first wave of scrutiny. She had been using him as a distraction, and she had been using me as a lifeboat. My name was formally cleared by the U.S. Attorney's Office 61 days after my suspension. The letter used phrases like no evidence of knowing participation and victim of credential theft and fully cooperative with federal investigators. Gerald framed a copy of it and gave it to me. It's on the wall of my home office. My credit took 14 months to fully restore. The fraudulent LLCs were dissolved. The loan accounts were flagged as fraudulent and removed from my credit history. Gerald and I pursued civil action against Meridian for the retaliatory suspension they settled, and I'm not able to share the terms. Sandra Reeves was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. She pled guilty to wire fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of justice, among other charges. The obstruction charge, which included her deliberate attempt to position me as the primary suspect, added significantly to her sentence. Douglas Fitch received a lighter sentence after his cooperation. He was ordered to pay full restitution and served 22 months. I want to tell you what I've taken from all of this, because I think there are things here that are worth sitting with. The first thing is about systems. I reported through a system the company's internal ethics and HR process, and the system failed me completely, not because systems are inherently bad, but because systems are made of people, and the people who controlled that system were the ones I should have been afraid of. There is no process, no policy, no reporting mechanism that is stronger than the integrity of the people who run it. Remember that. The second thing is about intuition. The moment Sandra cleared me to leave her office and I walked back to my desk, there was a small, quiet feeling, not quite a thought, more like a current running underneath the surface, that something hadn't quite landed the way I expected. I don't know what I expected her to say, but I know that what she said didn't fully satisfy that feeling. I dismissed it. I told myself I was being paranoid. That small, quiet feeling was right. The third thing is harder to say, and I want to say it carefully. I am glad I reported. Even knowing everything that followed the suspension, the interview room, the 14 months of credit repair, the sleepless nights, the conversations with Claire, where we genuinely didn't know how this was going to end. I am still glad. Because the alternative is that Sandra Reeves is still in that office, still using people's identities, still collecting loan money under someone else's name. There are 4 of us who were victimized. There might have been 10, 20. She was good at what she did, and she had been doing it for years. I'm glad she's not doing it anymore. But I want to be very clear about something. The outcome I got: the federal investigation that was already running, the attorney who moved fast, the documentation errors Sandra made under pressure that was luck layered on top of action. If I had waited another week to call Gerald, the narrative might have hardened around me in ways that were much harder to dismantle. If the FBI hadn't already been watching Meridian from an external tip, my case might have stayed buried under the administrative process Sandra controlled. Luck and action. In that order. I'm not a dramatic person by nature. I don't enjoy conflict. I went into accounting because I find order satisfying. I like it when numbers tell a true story. What happened to me was a profoundly disordered experience, and part of what still haunts me is the gap between the story the numbers were being made to tell, the one with my name on every fraudulent document, and the true story underneath it. I spent my career finding gaps between those two things. I just never expected to find myself living inside one. Claire asked me once, about a year after everything was resolved, whether I wished I had just let the $47,000 transfer go. Just cleared the flag myself and moved on. She wasn't being cruel, she was genuinely asking, because she had watched what the whole experience cost me, and she wanted to understand whether I had any regret about the decision point. I thought about it honestly, and the answer is no. Not because I'm noble, and not because the outcome vindicated me, though it did, but because the moment I saw that number, I knew what it meant, and I knew that I knew. And I am not capable of sitting comfortably in the knowledge that something is wrong and pretending I didn't see it. That's either a strength or a burden. Some days I'm not sure which. What I am sure of is this: 3 years of my identity had been quietly dismantled and repurposed by someone who sat 60 feet from my desk and smiled when she saw me in the hallway. $812,000 borrowed in my name. 5 hard credit inquiries I never authorized. 2 companies I never founded. And the thing that exposed all of it, the thing that finally unraveled the whole structure she had spent 3 years building, was me noticing a number that didn't belong on a Tuesday morning in February. One number. $47,000. Assigned to a vendor code that led nowhere. That's where it started. And that's where her scheme ended. If you're in a position where you found something at work, in your finances, somewhere in the numbers, and you're sitting with that quiet feeling that something is wrong, trust it. Document everything. Call an attorney before you call anyone inside the organization, and do not hand your evidence to the person who might be responsible for protecting it. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it.